everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Finegold. This is our weekly lecture series, Great Openings of the Past. Although, not really. I just thought that would be funny to say. Tonight's lecture topic is on the Sicilian Grand Prix. And I have to make a lot of assumptions and do a lot of guesswork because the sponsor, who's Michael H., thanks for sponsoring the lecture. And also, thanks for making it slightly confusing to me. So that means I might get this lecture wrong, but it'll still be very interesting. But maybe the sponsor will be angry. But maybe that's good if the sponsor is angry. I don't know. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, make sure it's confusing like this one, contact my wife, Karen. Her information is on the screen now if you're watching on YouTube. If you're watching live, then you're like, what's he talking about? Anyway, so I made a lot of assumptions, and also there was some cryptic messages from the sponsor about what the lecture should be about. So there's a small chance this lecture has nothing to do with what the sponsor wanted. So I think I got it right though. So I'm guessing the sponsor was interested from White's point of view. And if you want a lecture on an opening that's played from one side and you want to know how to play against that opening, then you should say that when you sponsor, like, my opponent plays the advanced French and I have black and I want to know how to play against the advanced French. If instead you write, I want a lecture on the advanced French, since White plays the advanced French with e5, I would assume it's from White's point of view. But, maybe you play the French and you have trouble against the advanced French and you don't care what White does, you want to win with black. So the sponsor gave some cryptic messages, and what I gathered from that was the sponsor, again, Michael H., I guess he's putting it in H. So that's why he's Michael H. He wanted to know, from what I gather, and again, I could be wrong, how you play the Grand Prix attack if your opponent doesn't let you. And your opponent not letting you was a bit confusing. I think what he meant was, like, there's main lines of the Grand Prix attack, which we're going to look at. And then we're going to look at some games in not so common lines that black could play that would try to prevent you from playing the Grand Prix attack. Now, of course, you could really confuse me, which is funny. You could say, I like to have White in the French defense. So I play e4. And so this lecture is on the French defense, because I want to win with e4 more, and I have White in the French defense. I don't play the French defense when I'm black. But some people don't play the French defense. Sometimes when I play e4, they play the Caro-Kann and the Sicilian and the Scandi and the Pierz and the Alekhine. And I want you to show me what to do against those, because I already beat the French every game. Now, that would be a weird lecture, which is basically everything but the French, because I like having White in the French. I don't care about that. Just show me everything else. And it seemed like that's sort of what the sponsor wanted. When I'm White in the Grand Prix attack and it's a normal main line, then I'm happy. And we have a new visitor. Okay, cool. Welcome to the lecture. I've only looked at E4, so the slow going lecture. And then make sure you mute your microphone so we don't hear any weird noises. The only weird noises you're going to hear are emanating from me. Okay. And maybe I should mute my microphone. Oh, I didn't change the name from Karen Boyd to Ben Finegold. So that means the lecturer today is Karen. It just looks like me. Okay, So we're going to assume that black plays c5, which is the Sicilian. Grand Prix attack, according to the internet, is white plays knight c3 and then plays f4. And most grandmasters who want to play knight c3 and f4, the reason they don't play f4 on move 2 is they think d5 is a good response. And that's another lecture. But if a grandmaster plays the Grand Prix with f4, 9 times out of 10, they're going to play knight c3 and then play f4. Okay, and black usually in this position plays knight c6. Now, we're going to look at 5 different variations in this lecture from 5 different games. And I want to point out something that may or may not be true, but I believe it because I read it on the internet. The reason this is called the Grand Prix is in the UK, they have a series of tournaments, open tournaments, and this happens in the US also, that are called Grand Prix events. Those are events with reasonable prize funds that you might find grandmasters and IMs playing in. And the difference between open Swiss tournaments like the World Open, the National Open, the Chicago Open, US Masters, tournaments in the US that are open tournaments, and round robin tournaments where everybody's 2750 and you can watch the best players in the world play with good commentary live. The difference in those tournaments are that if you play in one of the tournaments with Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru and Firouzja, and those are the weak players, tough tournament, you don't need to win all of your games to win the tournament. In some instances, for example, in a 9-round tournament, you could have 3 wins and 6 draws and win those tournaments because nobody's winning a lot of games because everybody's really good. So most of the games are draws. Occasionally, somebody loses. So if somehow you can win 3 or 4 games, which is a lot, and go undefeated and not lose any, you can win these tournaments with a small plus score. And everybody's getting around 50% because everybody's really good. Conversely, the other tournaments I was talking about, open tournaments, you can't do that. If you play in an open tournament and you have 7 draws and 2 wins, you get nothing and you lose rating points. And the young players, draw you even though they're 300 points lower rated. So in Swiss tournaments, and especially on the UK Grand Prix, there's a lot of mismatches where the first few rounds, the grandmasters are playing Rufus and Doofus. And if you're rated 2,500, 2,600 FIDE, and your opponent's rated 1,900, 2,000, 2,100, which often happens in the first and second rounds of open tournaments, you can't draw games. You can't win the tournament doing that, and your rating goes down. You're required to win. And in the UK, it was very common for white to play knight c3, f4, knight f3, and get sort of a wild and crazy kingside attack so that you don't have a lot of draws. And hopefully, if you're 500 points higher rated than your opponent and you have an attack, you can be successful. And so a lot of the people who play white in the Grand Prix are British grandmasters. And in fact, one of the most successful, which we have 2 games from in this lecture, is Gawain Jones. Gawain Jones plays the Grand Prix attack almost every game, even when he's black. Hard to understand. Okay. So in this game was played in the World Junior Championship against Das Abhishek in 2007. And Gawain Jones played an unusual move order but that's okay because they transposed back into like the normal f4. He played bishop b5. And the age-old question, and you can argue if you want, in fact, if you're writing in the YouTube comments, usually there's dozens of comments on YouTube when I make these videos, you guys can argue in the chat about whether white should play bishop c4 or bishop b5 in the Grand Prix attack, and which one actually is the Grand Prix attack. And according to the internet, they both are. The important thing is white plays f4. But there are some people only play bishop c4, and some people only play bishop b5. I didn't want to shut anybody out, so we're going to look at games with both moves. Okay, after bishop b5, black played g6. And basically, in the Grand Prix attack, there's three things your opponent can do if they're black. They can play g6, they can play e6, or they can play both. And we're going to see examples of all of that. And in the Grand Prix attack, black has a problem with the queen bishop, which happens in a lot of openings. The king bishop usually fianchettos, it's on a nice diagonal, and this bishop, after like a6 and e6, is just behind all these pawns. So that's one of black's issues. Conversely, usually, but not always, white plays d3 in the Grand Prix attack, and the bishop on f1 isn't blocked by the d pawn because we're going to c4 or b5. Okay, so g6, white captures and doubles black's pawns. Black can take either way. Black took with the d pawn, and then f4. And of course, this position could be reached with white playing f4 before bishop b5. And they just transpose. And if you have white in the Grand Prix and you play bishop b5, if you don't play bishop b5, but you always play bishop c4, we got games in that line too. But this lecture is not 5 hours long, so I can't look at every legal move. But it's a different way to play for white. Sometimes when white plays bishop b5 and takes, it's a positional game where white's trying to get an advantage because black's pawn structure is compromised. And usually when white plays bishop c4, white's just playing for checkmate. f5, knight g5, queen h4, rook lift, bishop h6, rawr. And we're going to see examples of all of that. Okay, so black castles, white castles, b6, very solid, and queen e1. And probably in about 75 to 80% of Grand Prix attacks for white, white plays queen e1 and then tries to play queen h4 and f5 and starts attacking the black king. Queen e1, very normal move. Now, a lot of times, white hasn't captured this knight on c6 because white's played bishop c4 or white just didn't get around to taking on c6. In those instances, black often plays knight d4, attacking the c pawn. White has to decide, do I defend my c pawn or do I play knight takes knight? Since white's already taken the knight on c6, we don't have to worry about our c pawn. That's not getting attacked, so we can move our queen away from our c pawn and not care about that. Okay, bishop g4. Black has the two bishops. After bishop g4, black doesn't have the two bishops because black's going to take the knight and get control of the d4 square. So like already I like white because I don't like the doubled pawns. I don't like that black's already giving up their two bishops. And white has this nice center structure. Black doesn't really have any counterplay against the white center. Okay, knight e5. White's threatening take on c6. Also, I could get my 2 bishops back. Or I could play f5 and trap your bishop and try to win your bishop. So white's got a lot going on, and black is on the back foot here. Queen c7, defending the c6 pawn, and also putting pressure on the knight. So if white tries to play f5 to trap the bishop, the knight on e5 is not protected. Queen h4, that's why white played queen e1. Now white's threatening to win a piece. So bishop moves back. Again, if white plays f5, the knight on e5 is hanging. So white played knight f3 because the knight's always hanging in all these variations. Now white has the option to play knight g5 later, which looks annoying, or f5, or e5, or all three. h6, stopping white from playing knight g5, although that makes f5 look better. So I don't like h6. f5. And black had one idea in mind when black played h6. And that idea was, if white plays f5, threatening my bishop and threatening bishop takes h6, I'm going to block up the king side and play g5. Then when the white queen moves away, I'll move my bishop away, and the king side's all blocked up, so white can't checkmate me. Of course, when white played f5, they had no intention of moving the queen away from h4. And this is very typical, and this is how you get better at chess. Now, this is a chess lecture, and there's a topic, but I also like to get you guys better at chess. In the Grand Prix attack, when white plays queen h4 and f5, which are moves that white wants to play in the Grand Prix attack, white's not going to be shy about sacrificing. White is going to sacrifice a pawn, 2 pawns, a piece, and try to checkmate black. Because black doesn't have good defensive setup. Black's queen and black's rooks don't have any defense, and the G and H files are going to be open to the black king, which doesn't have anywhere to run to. So white sacrifices a piece, which was always the intent when they played f5. And now the bishop on e6 is attacked. So if white takes the bishop on e6, white's ahead material. So black saved their bishop. And now white just has an attack. White can move the pawns, the rooks, the queen and bishop. My knight can come over and start attacking also. And I mean, this just looks terrible for black. Black's extra piece is meaningless. Black doesn't have any counterplay. So white played rook f3. White's going to play rook g3 or rook h3. They both look good. Rook d8, black's going to run away when white's, checkmating him. Bishop h6. Now white's threatening rook g3, which is very annoying. So knight e8, defending. Bishop takes. You can't play king takes because rook g3 check, and if king f8, then checkmate. Black's position looks terrible. All pieces are on the back rank. So he took with the knight. That's why he played knight e8. Rook h3, threatening queen h8 mate. And now black should have resigned because the only reasonable way to stop queen h8 mate is to make a move you never play. How could he break my rules like this? Now, he has a good excuse from breaking my rules. This game was played in 2007. So I don't think never play f6 was a rule in 2007, although it might have been. Okay, so he played f6 so that queen here is not mate because king f7, check, queen g6 check. You can't play king f8 because rook h8 is checkmate, so you have to play king g8. And then white, who had just watched the movie Tombstone, said he's got 2 rooks, 1 for each of you. And he played rook f1. because white has another rook. And some of you may be wondering, why didn't white play rook h7 and then queen takes knight mate? And actually, you're going to find out because black played the defensive move that he would have played against rook f1. And that is to move the e-pawn, and the queen defends the knight. So white just gets another piece into the attack. Black does move the e-pawn, so the knight's defended. Queen h7 check. Takes on e6, opening up the line for the rook. Bishop takes. Rook h6, threatening the f-pawn with both rooks. Queen e5. White doesn't want to take on f6 and trade the rooks for the queen, because white's not in the trading business. White's in the checkmate business. White doesn't want to trade pieces. White wants all the pieces on the board so we can deliver checkmate. So queen g6 again. You have to move your king back. King f8, rook takes f6 check. That's not good. And king e7 hangs the knight on g7. So black played king g8. White played rook takes f6. White's threatening queen h7 checkmate. Black gave a spite check. And I mean, I would have played king h1, but it doesn't matter. He played rook f2. Now white's threatening queen h7 mate, and the only reasonable defense is to resign. The other defense is to give your queen away for the rook. Oh, actually, I see why he didn't play king h1. See, I would have lost this game. Yeah, after king h1, which he didn't play, we sacrifice our queen and play rook f8, and we have rook f1 mate. So now black is doing okay. Yeah, that's why he played rook f2, because then there's no back rank nonsense, and we're threatening queen h7 mate. And black resigned. So if you play the Grand Prix attack with white, this is a game that you'll want to look at, because this is how you play the Grand Prix attack with white. You play queen e1 to h4, play f5, you sack a piece, you get your pieces on the black king, and you don't miscalculate like me. Calculate well, then you win the game pretty quickly. You'll notice black's rook on a8 never moved, never got into the game, and black basically never made a threat. Black was just defending the whole game. Okay. Next game was played in 1947. White was Kasparian, and black was David Bronstein. This was in the Soviet Championship, 1947. So you're not going to see a lot of theory because it's 1947, but you're going to see a lot of positional play, which happens when black doesn't play g6, but plays e6 and never plays g6. Okay, so he played e6, d5, bishop b5, and obviously in the Grand Prix attack, whether you play bishop c4 or bishop b5, you're not playing bishop c4 here. So what white wants to do is take this knight, ruin black's pawn structure, and then play for positional against this bishop on c8, which is blocked by all these pawns. Knight f6, e5, and white takes. And now this is a very important strategical idea, especially for players rated under 2,000, which is 99% of people. This position, at some point in the game, you have to decide whether to play d3 or d4. And for lower rated players, they pick one. And higher rated player would never play d4 because that just helps out black. Black has these double pawns, and he's got all these pawns here which block the bishop on c8. And after d4, black gets rid of the double pawns and plays c5, and the bishop can go to b7, and we have a nice open bishop on the diagonal once black plays d4. White never wants to play d4 and open the position up for black's bishops. Black has the two bishops, but what good are they? One's going to go here and not move. One's going to go here and not move. So white's playing positionally. White castled and played d3. Now, white can decide whether to play on the king's side or the queen's side, or do both. And typically, with this pawn weakness on c5, defended by knight and bishop, but you can't defend it with a pawn, often white plays b3, knight a4, either bishop e3 or bishop a3. Sometimes the queen goes to f2, and we put a lot of pressure on the c pawn. Okay, so white played queen e1. White's not giving away what they're going to do. Is white going to play queen g3, play for checkmate? Or is white going to do what I said and play queen f2 and put pressure on this pawn later? Rook b8, b3. And black just doesn't have a lot of aggressive options. And with the queen on e1, we make it more difficult to move the f pawn because the queen is on the e6 pawn. So black has to be careful. Bishop a3, bishop on a6. What's the bishop doing on a6? White plays knight d1. This is twofold. White wants to play c4, which basically kills this bishop. And white wants to move the knight over to the king's side and get some kind of checkmating attack. And the center is completely blocked, so white can play on either wing, and black is very passive. Black played f5, which has the intent of stopping white from checkmating him on the king's side by controlling some of the king's side. White plays queen a5 and says, I'll play on the queen's side. And you have all these weak pawns there. I can take all of them. The bishop's hanging, so bishop b7. Queen takes a7 is too risky because the white queen could get trapped. So white played knight b2. White's going to play knight a4 and try to win this pawn on c5. Queen d8. Queen c3. White's again trying to win that c pawn. Knight a4. White's attacking the c pawn pretty good. Black is playing a bishop c8 to b7 to a6 to b7. Queen e8 to d8. Black's not doing nothing. And black made positional concession of playing d4. This makes sure these pawns are terrible, and we give the c4 square away. So later in the game, white can play knight b2, knight d2, and put knights on c4. And it's hard to suggest an active plan for black. So it's funny, sometimes in the Grand Prix attack, white checkmates black, and sometimes when black plays a different way, black gets these weak doubled pawns on the queen's side, and black is just very passive. Okay, but Bronstein, he's not a passive player, so he's going to try to do something. And the idea of knight c4 is, well, the knight's good on c4. White wants black to take on c4, and then when white takes back, white's controlling the d5 square, so black doesn't have knight d5, and so forth. And black doesn't want white's knight on c4, and if black does play knight d5, black still can't play knight e3 because the knight's on c4. So it's tough to play black. Black played h6. Looks like black might want to play g5 or stop white from playing knight g5 later. King h1. White's going to play rook g1 and g4, and he's going to say, all your pieces are over here. I'm going to attack your king. Rook e1, rook b7, rook g1 to play aforementioned g4, knight d5, and knight d6. Knight d6 is a positional move because this bishop on b5 is terrible, and with our rook on e1 and your e6 pawn is going to be backward if you take my knight, I'll have the e5 square for my knight. And also, of tactical note, if black takes twice on a d6, the bishop is pinning the c pawn, so knight takes d4 is possible. So knight d6 also threatens the rook, puts the knight on an excellent square, and it also threatens bishop takes c5. So knight d6 is a pretty good move. Takes, queen takes. Now the f pawn is attacked. So white played rook e5. Now the f pawn is not attacked. Now white has two ideas. One is to double rooks on the e file, putting pressure on e6. The other is just to take on d4 and win the pawn back due to this pin. And it's hard for black to escape the pin because the queen is defending the c pawn. We can't allow bishop takes c5. Then our d pawn falls. Terrible. e6 pawn is weak. Bishop on b5, terrible. Okay, so he played rook f6, rook e1. White's not in a hurry. Knight takes d4 finally. White wins. Pawn back. Black has a terrible pawn structure. e6 is hanging. Rook a6, attacking the bishop. Queen c1, defending the bishop. Knight b4. Knight takes e6. White's a pawn ahead. And Bronstein wins his pawn back with tactical beans because the queen's defending the bishop, and the queen's defending the knight, the queen's defending the rook. The queen's overworked. Queen takes, rook takes. Now the rook is terribly placed on a3, and the c5 pawn is a goner, and when we capture it with the knight, then we defend our d4, our d3 pawn. And this position, black blundered, and on the internet, somebody said, oh, in this game, black blundered in time trouble. And somebody else points it out, it's not really a blunder because the rook is trapped. So if it's white's move, white's going to play b4. Now, if you're a grandmaster and you look at this position without calculating, it looks awful for black. Black's rook is trapped on a5. White totally dominates the e file in the center. The knight on c5 is great. White's threatening not only b4, but knight b7, forking the queen and rook. And this position is terrible. So, although this move loses immediately, you could argue that no matter what black does, he's going to lose immediately. So he played bishop takes d3. This is a simple tactical blunder. And of course, 1947, I don't think Bronstein was Bronstein yet. I think he was a young Bronstein. And I should know, because I've played Bronstein twice. Roar! So I played Bronstein 40 years after this game. So I played Bronstein after he was Bronstein, and this was before he was Bronstein. Bishop takes d3 wins a pawn, and it threatens the knight on c5. But very simply, white just takes the bishop, and the rook is attacked on a5. So there's two lines to calculate. There's rook takes, which loses to pawn takes, forking the queen and rook, or knight takes, white's a knight up. And then there's queen takes knight, rook takes rook, and white's a rook up. So after knight takes d3, black resigned. So white was in control that game, black was on the defensive, and eventually, I think the strong move this game was when white played knight d6, sacrificing a pawn temporarily, opening up the center, and then white took all of black's weak pawns, and black's pieces were just always bad. Black went from a very bad bishop on b5 to a very bad rook on a5. Frankly, terrible. Go Kasparian. Let's see, no. Okay, the next game is Alexander Ivanov is white. He's one of the many Ivanovs who's a grandmaster. Against Michiel Abeln. This was played in the Netherlands Open Championship in 1992. If I remember correctly, and I don't, I think I played Alexander Ivanov in the New York Open in 1992. I've played Alexander Ivanov a lot of games because he moved to America in the late 80s, early 90s, and still lives in America and still plays chess. Okay, so we got our Grand Prix attack. This is the normal move order. And Ivanov played bishop c4, which we haven't looked at yet. We looked at bishop b5, e6, and if you play the Grand Prix attack, then you play f5. You don't care if it loses a pawn. You're trying to get an attack on the black king. And it would be silly for black to take this pawn twice and open up the bishop and doubled isolated f-pawns with an open black king. It doesn't make any sense. What black wants to do is keep this pawn on e6 so that the bishop, can't have its say later. And one of the ideas behind f5, other than, attacking the black king, is we open up this diagonal for the white bishop. And we saw that in the first game of the lecture when white played f5, g5, white sacrificed the knight, put the bishop on g5, and white's bishop had an open attack against the black king. So f5 not only puts pressure here, but it also leaves this diagonal open for the white bishop later. Okay. Knight e7 is the main move. Now if I was black, I'd probably take this pawn because I can take back with the knight. So white takes. Black can take either way. They're both theory, the f pawn or the d pawn. Most people take with the d pawn because they think it looks safer. I have two pawns in front of the bishop instead of one, and leave the f file somewhat closed. So d takes looks safer. But on the other hand, black can't play d5 anymore, which is the reasons black played e6, knight e7 was to play d5. Okay, d3, getting our bishop open. Bishop d7 seems very passive. Castles. Queen e1. We've seen queen e1 before. White wants to play queen h4, bishop h6, knight g5, etc. Playing for checkmate. Knight d4. I explained this already. I said when white hasn't taken this and doubled the pawns, often after queen e1, black plays knight d4 and attacks c2. White took the knight. Bishop takes. King h1. Knight c6. Black is dominating the dark squares in the middle. Bishop f4. I probably would have played bishop h6. Alexander Ivanov. Bishop e5. And I don't like this idea black had of trading the dark squared bishops, because now it's a lot of holes around black's king and black gets punished very soon. So I don't like bishop e5, bishop takes f4. I think that leads black to a lost position. Knight d4, threatening c2. Ivanov ignores that, says if you take on c2, I can take on c5, and your knight's trapped temporarily. Knight takes c2 doesn't win a pawn. So black played b5, getting counterplay on the queen side. b4. And in this position, in my opinion, black took the wrong minor piece. I'm not super afraid of this bishop since I have these two pawns here. But he took the bishop anyway, and now the white knight gets to attack on the king side. And black doesn't have any counterplay. White's just going to attack on the king side, and black's going to get checkmated. So, truth hurts. That's why white is a grandmaster, and black is a Dutch guy I've never heard of. e5, making the bishop a little bit better. Rook f6. Queen h6. It's getting scary over there. Knight g3. Again, white can win very slowly. I don't see black doing stuff. Black doesn't have any counterplay. So I don't like this black exchanging off their dark squared bishop. I'm against it. Although I'm rooting for white in these games, so I'm pretty happy. Rook e6, trying to trade rooks. Knight h5, threatening queen g7 mate with advantage. And there wasn't much to calculate. Like, you got to stop queen g7 mate, so you have to take the knight. Then after queen g5 check, there's one legal move. And then after rook takes f7, we're threatening queen g7 mate and rook takes f8 mate. And that's your extra piece, the one that's never going to move. Man, the truth hurts. Okay, so black resigned, but let's not resign and look at some cool variations. One cool variation is rook g8. Then white sacrifices another piece. Rook f7 check. Then queen takes h5 check, and then mate. So rook g8 doesn't work. If you play rook g6, stopping queen g7, I take. Now, white's up material, so black can resign because black's down material, but white also has mate. So rook g6, that didn't work out. Then there's rook takes rook. I guess that's sort of the obvious move. Okay, now white's threatening rook f8 mate and queen g7 mate. So I guess I play rook g6 since I don't see another move. Then I'm guessing more than one move wins, but this seems to really win. Queen takes h5. There's actually a really cool variation here. So black has to play rook g7. I don't see another move. Got to play rook g7. I check. This is the only legal move. And then queen f7. When I say the truth hurts, for the rest of my life, I'm going to be thinking of this position. The truth hurts. And those are the kinds of games, the first game and this one, where we're playing the Grand Prix attack with white, and we're trying to get a mating attack, and we're willing to sacrifice material to do so. And a lot of times, when white's attacking in the Grand Prix attack, sometimes throwing in a sacrifice to open up the black king, games end pretty quickly. Okay, this is the game Parham Maghsoodloo against Martin Cerveny. This was from a Title Tuesday Blitz game in June of 2020. And a lot of super grandmasters who may not be willing to play the Grand Prix attack in a slow game are very willing to play in Blitz and Rapid because it's very difficult to defend with black. And if you're not facing the opening very often with black, a lot of times you forget your theory. And like I said, it's a good opening to beat lower rated players. Typically the higher rated player understands what's going on better. Now, Sometimes you want to play the Grand Prix attack and your opponent doesn't let you. Plays a6. And I've played a6 with black also. White plays f4. White just plays the Grand Prix attack. And in this game, white actually, again, white looks like they're playing a Grand Prix attack. And obviously, when black plays a6, b5, there's no bishop c4 and there's no bishop b5. But we can still play in the spirit. So it looks like a close Sicilian, except black hasn't developed their king side. Black spent a lot of time developing their queen side. So white goes on the attack, just like in the Grand Prix attack. If you play the Grand Prix with white, then this is a very obvious move. If you don't play the Grand Prix attack with white, you might play bishop e3, queen e2, rook e1, king h1, then maybe g4. But if you play the Grand Prix attack, then you play f5. That's what we do in the Grand Prix attack, is we try to open up black's king because white's castled and black can't even castle now. b4 attacking the knight. He takes. He says, why don't you take my knight and I'll take on f7, and black's king is not safe. And this is a blitz game, so whether or not that's good for white, in a blitz game, that's really good for white. But it's good in a slow game too. Black just recaptured knight e2, and the knights are going to come and crush you on the e6 square because the bishop's on b7, not protecting e6. Here come the knights. Knight g5. White's two knights, one for each of you. Now black can't castle because the knight's stopping him. Black plays bishop c8. Says, get your knights out of here. Bishop h3. White says, no, I like my knight on e6. Takes. Knight takes. h6, stopping the knight from going back later. And more importantly, much more importantly, stopping bishop g5, in which case white would be threatening knight takes bishop check and then bishop takes knight. And this is really nice what white did here, because a lot of my students, when I used to have live lessons, which I don't anymore because the internet exists, but before the internet, when I would see my students face to face and I would ask them what to play in any position, half the time their head is tilted. So white's attacking on the king side, white has a knight on e6, and they're just staring at the king side. And white plays c3 because the queen can go to a4 check, and that's very annoying. I don't know what black does against that. Black played knight c6, which is a blunder, although I would say with the knight on e6, black's lost anyway. Queen a4 just wins the game. There's no move here. The game is over. And that's what happens in the Grand Prix attack. Sometimes the guy attacks and there's no defense. The queen is defending the bishop on g7. Bishop on g7 is defending the knight. So you can't have your queen move and start defending your knight on c6. Because I'll take on g7, and if you take back on g7, I take on c6. You can defend with your king, very suspicious. Then I would guess the best move is knight d4 check, and then I win your knight on c6, and probably mate you too. And then rook c8 is sort of the obvious move, and now the rook is on the same diagonal as the bishop, so knight takes g7 check, and the rook's hanging 2/3. So after queen a4, black just resigned. That game ended pretty quickly, and that's why in the Grand Prix circuit in the UK, it's a very common opening for white, because if black makes a mistake in defense, white can win the game in less than 20 moves. Okay, we're going to go a little overtime this lecture, and we're going to look at another Gawain Jones game. This is with Richard Bates, played in an open tournament in the UK in 2010. Sort of the main move order of the Grand Prix attack. And Gawain Jones plays bishop b5 again. And we haven't seen this line yet. This is one of the main lines. Castles. And black played knight h6, which is a move I'm not familiar with. Black doesn't want to play knight f6 and block the bishop. White can play e5. Black doesn't want to play e6, knight e7 castles, because that takes too long, although that's what I would play. So they play knight h6, then they can castle next move. Maybe they'll play f5 and so forth. And the knight doesn't block the bishop. Gawain Jones played d3, trying to get this bishop open. Castles, f5. It shouldn't be a surprise to see f5 pawn sack in the Grand Prix attack. That's what white does. White tries to checkmate black very quickly. Black plays d5, which is super complicated tactically. And if black takes on f5, white can just ignore it. And white can play bishop g5. Sometimes white plays queen e1 to h4, lets black take the rook on a1, then white takes the knight on h6. And white says, yeah, you took my rook on a1, and I'm going to checkmate you now. So sometimes that happens. But black played d5. I'm not sure if that's preparation or desperation. Knight takes d4, knight takes d5, white's a pawn ahead, and black plays knight takes f5, because the e-pawn is doing double duty here. Takes, queen takes, white obviously plays bishop c4. So if you play the Grand Prix attack and you like bishop b5, or you play the Grand Prix attack and you like bishop c4, this is your kind of game, because white played them both. White played bishop b5, then played bishop c4. Queen c6. Takes. White has big attack brewing on the open f line. H takes. Bishop g5, threatening e7 pawn. b5. Bishop b7, black threatens mate in 1. Queen g4, once again, white's threatening e7 and stopping mate. Rook e8. White softens up black's queen side, plays rook e1. The reason white has a good position here is white has rooks on the open files with threats on f7 and e7, and black's rooks are defending and can't move vertically. So white's pieces are all perfect, and white has a better pawn structure also. Black's b pawn is isolated. And white's king is safer because we have an open h-file here, and we have big attack on the pawn on f7, which white can increase the advantage later. Black played e6, which I'm sure loses, and the idea is it stops all of white's play with these three pieces. It stops the white bishop from killing you on f7, it stops the white rook from killing you on e7, and it stops the battery or the double attack that white had on f7 with the bishop and the rook. Fortunately, e6 gives up the f6 square, so bishop f6. And this is like the Ivanov game that we looked at 15 minutes ago, where black's going to have to part with their dark squared bishop, and their king's going to be too exposed. Rook's on f6 again. And this is just a free attack for white. Queen c5. White was going to play queen takes d4 later. White didn't play queen takes d4 earlier because of the mate threat. But obviously white could just play rook f2. And somehow black has to defend e5 or d4. So he plays queen to c5. Queen f4. That's the Gawain Jones gun, tripling on the f pawn. rook e7, defending the f-pawn, and Jones plays a nice tactic to win the game. Strategically, white's winning because black's rooks are so passive. But tactically, white's winning with rook g6 check. Obviously, if you take, I take this way. And I have a funny way to win here, which may not be the best way to win, but it is the funniest. I can play rook f7 check, and your rook is pinned. You have to take the rook because there's no other legal move than I take your queen. So you can't take the rook with the pawn. You can't not take the rook, so you have to play king takes. And white's not trying to win this rook because that rook's defended. White's going to checkmate black because of the open G and H files. And it doesn't matter what black does here, but he played king h7, then rook f4, threatening rook h4 check, and rook h8 or queen h8 mate. Not easy to stop. The truth hurts. So in this position, black played queen h5, and unfortunately, white doesn't take the rook and give black a spite check. White just plays rook h4, and white says, I'm going to win your queen, and when I'm done winning your queen, I'm going to win your rook. If somehow black could sacrifice the queen for the rook and save this rook, then black would have two rooks for a queen. But black can't do that. Black has no way to defend their queen, and your rook's hanging. So the most obvious move is queen takes rook, queen takes check, king moves somewhere, and then you lose the rook. So after rook h4, black resigned. So that was some examples of white getting a monster attack, playing the Grand Prix attack. In one instance, it was very positional on the queen side, with Bronstein losing a game where he really never really had a good game. He was always on the back foot. And the other games seemed like they were just nice mating attacks. And those kinds of ideas that white has, putting the queen on h4, sacrificing a pawn with f5, getting the bishop into the game, that's the typical Grand Prix attack kind of play. And if you want to look at games by people who play the Grand Prix attack a lot, I recommend Gawain Jones. And also, there's a lot of examples, especially in Blitz and Rapid, and especially 20 years ago, of Hikaru Nakamura playing white in the Grand Prix attack. The reason is his stepfather, Sunil Weermantree, who's a FIDE master, that's what he played his whole career. And Hikaru grew up in the household, and he's like, learning it from Sunil when Hikaru was a little kid. So when Hikaru was a teenager, he was playing a lot of Grand Prix attacks with white, because that's what his stepdad did. And they both won with scintillating attacks, although Sunil is a famous chess coach. Hikaru far surpasses him in chess play. I want to again thank Michael H. Put it in H. White put it in H the last game, for sponsoring the lecture. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife Karen. Her email is on the screen right now if you're watching on YouTube. And thanks for watching, everybody. I'll see you guys next time with more weekly lectures. Bye, everybody.